Welcome, everyone, to the first official Archangel's Feast podcast. There might be a couple of you who are aware that this isn't the first podcast that I'm putting up on this channel. I've had about 10 so far where I grab a friend, we pick a topic, and I kind of browbeat them with my theories around it. And I intend to keep doing that. But I also want to start putting out podcasts that are geared towards my guest's area of expertise and use that topic as the launching pad for our conversations. So going forward, these types of conversations will be the official channel podcasts, and the podcasts where I just kind of pick a buddy and record our cigar and bonfire type chats are going to get labeled differently. So for this podcast, I sat down with my soon-to-be brother-in-law to talk about God attachment. For those of you who don't know, attachment theory more broadly provides a sort of personality test for your attachment style, and there's 4. So you could have a secure attachment, insecure avoidant attachment, anxious ambivalent attachment, or disorganized attachment. And these attachment styles form at a young age, and they're interesting psychologically because they're predictors of many outcomes, from health to how secure you feel in a relationship to whether you'll be taken advantage of. And God attachment has to do with people's attachment styles to a higher power. So Jojo has research experience in God attachment, and we ended up having a pretty great conversation about attachment theory and his research in God attachment. After that, we kind of went on to borrow the language and stretch the concepts a bit around God attachment, and we talked about people's relationship to reality more broadly. So in other words, like, do you see the world as a place that just kind of sucks until you die? Is life just one massive, overbearing series of struggles that may or may not get interrupted with moments of joy? Or is it possible to just have a totally different experience of suffering, where even things like trauma and abuse can get reharmonized into a broader picture of reality, which isn't as grim? And what would a person who can do that actually look like? And so God attachment is interesting here for this conversation because I think we can take the concepts and vocabulary around attachment and start having conversations across belief systems at the level of your relationship with reality in a common language that kind of transcends your belief system. And I think this has lots of applications, right? From a fresh way of tackling the problem of evil to having better conversations with people in other worldviews. So, for example, you might have heard, some atheists on the internet try to dismiss belief in God, right? With maybe a single YouTube comment saying something like, religious people are only religious because of superstition, or you only have faith in God because you don't understand science, or belief in God is just wishful thinking. And the fact that attachment theory applies to people's faiths, it just falsifies these oversimplifications. And so if we can become aware of the fact, that it's not so simple, I think this helps us get over this tendency to oversimplify the person sitting across from us. And I think this brings us into a place where we can have a more productive conversation about what do you really believe and how are you processing reality at a deeper level. So that's the podcast. Before we get into it, I want to mention there was a problem with the audio, and because of that, I decided to skip the introductory remarks and just kind of start in the middle. So sorry if the podcast starts off with a jolt, but there was plenty of good podcast after that point, so I hope you enjoy, and thanks for tuning in.
So with those mechanisms laid down, we can get into kind of the attachment styles. Now, I did just quick research before we began, and it's actually about 50% of the population, 50 to 60%. The numbers do vary depending on the study that you look at, have a secure attachment. And a secure attachment is kind of what we talked about in that example, right? The baby is able to come back to the mother, to feel comforted, and then to go back to exploring, okay, at the baby level. As you get older, secure attachment actually predict to a large extent how well your interpersonal relationships will be later on. And if you think about it, the kind of process of building a relationship comes from these sort of beliefs that the world is safe, that we'll be cared for, and that people are generally trustworthy and safe. Okay.
And that comes from secure attachment.
Yeah, these are all secure attachments. Now that, if you think about it, makes sense, because the primary caregiver has shown the baby a sort of outlook on life, right? That the world is generally safe, that people can be trusted, that my needs will be met, and that builds what we call an internal locus of control. Now I'm getting a little off topic, but it's important as well later on in our discussion. An internal locus control is just your sense of agency. How much can I change my surroundings, and how I feel? So those skills are developed, with a primary caregiver who is secure. Now, largely, what predicts a child's attachment style is the attachment style of the parent. So that's one of the reasons. Now, you could get into a few different reasons. The death of a caregiver, stress at a certain time in life. So that's secure. The next one is anxious ambivalent. An anxious ambivalent kind of looks like the needy person, who's constantly checking in on the relationship. How are we doing? Are you okay? Like, what's going on? What's wrong? They can't really feel okay. They can't be calmed down. And usually how this develops is the caregiver isn't consistent in their care, can sometimes shut down. And what this looks like is baby is kind of left needing to cry a lot before their diaper is changed. So the baby kind of learns to show these behaviors more and more in order to get what they need from the primary caregiver. The third attachment style is the avoidant one, and it kind of works kind of how it sounds. Is the baby doesn't really engage with the caregiver. Okay, so when he's stressed or when something goes wrong, like the mother leaves and comes back, the baby doesn't really notice the mother's absence. Okay, so those are insecure. So you have secure attachment and then 3 different kinds of insecure attachment. The last one is called disorganized attachment, and that's basically what we use to categorize anything that doesn't fit into the other categories. Disorganized attachments make up about 5% of attachment styles. And those are kids who have usually been traumatized early on in life, emotional abuse, neglect, sexual abuse. And to a large extent, your attachment styles can change over time. So they're not necessarily set in stone, but they can provide us with very strong predictors of later outcomes in life. So the reason why attachment theory has become so prevalent, not only in the realm of psychology, but in business, in pop psychology, sociology, all these different fields, is because of its predictive power, or at least one of the reasons why, is because it does, to a large degree, predict health outcomes. Now, there was one study that kind of illustrates this, done, I believe, at Harvard, where they had college undergraduates kind of give a summary of what they thought of their parents growing up. And the basic question goes something like, was there at least one person or one parent who you felt close to? Now, the people who responded negatively, that they weren't very close to their parents, I believe it was about 90% of those, the college undergraduates were questioned, kind of giving a statement of how they perceived their attachments with their parents. And then I think it was 30 or 35 years later, they did a follow-up and kind of checked for health outcomes. Now, those who displayed insecure attachment styles were 90% likely to have some sort of significant and chronic health issue. People with a secure attachment or a perceived secure attachment of their parents had about a 45% chance of having a negative health outcome 30 years later.
30 years?
Mm-hmm.
Wow. So a negative health outcome over the course of 30 years, like any time within the 30 years?
I can't remember the exact.
Or was it like 30 years later, something bad's going to happen?
30 years later, they had some sort of medical issue.
Gotcha. Well, so to kind of segue, why would we think that God is an attachment figure? So you were talking a lot about parents, but you said attachment figure can be anyone that, the kid clings to in the early years, or anyone in a kind of caretaking figure. Where does God come into this theory?
Right. Well, considering that I think at least 90% of people in America believe in some form of a higher power, it is not a big logical leap, to assert that perhaps this kind of image of God can also be attributed as an attachment figure, seeing as how a lot of people derive comfort in times of stress from their religious beliefs, from their relationship with God. Now, how it applies to attachment theory can apply to God. It provides kind of this robust framework for integrating research on religious development in children and perceptions of God later in life.
So yeah, I guess one way we can get there is by theorizing about it and thinking, maybe this is true. But another way is just to go out and measure it, right? So when we go out and we measure God attachment, right? When we act like God is the attachment figure and start coming up with ways of putting people on this attachment quad chart where you have maybe a secure relationship with God, or a anxious ambivalent. I was writing these down as you were saying them. Anxious ambivalent relationship with God, or a insecure avoidant and disorganized relationship with God. Can we put people on this quad chart, and then does that have predictive power, right? So we've done that, right?
So I believe, what researchers have done, first of all, was to try to correlate adult attachment styles with religious belief. And I believe that's where the curiosity began. Is how well does attachment styles, human to human, predict religious belief later on in life? And they did find some very significant things, in that people who had secure attachments were more likely to have a big influence on religious stability and kind of more stable socialization-based religiosity, meaning that they're more likely to engage in religious activity that was social, and they presented with more stable religious beliefs over time. So they were less likely to display religious attitudes that were emotional based. So I feel depressed, therefore God is. So let me backtrack a little bit. So a secure person, right, when they feel down or when they feel depressed, are less likely to believe that God is a judge, or God is kind of impersonal or unresponsive to me. They're more likely to have stable religious beliefs. Okay, like, okay, no, I'm feeling down, but that doesn't really affect my relationship with God or who He is, right? Whereas an insecure person, interpersonal, insecure, not attachment to God style, are more likely to have religious beliefs that reflect their emotional states. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So something about your attachment style to God has some predictive outcomes in terms of some, but not all, psychometrics.
So right now, I'm just talking about adult attachment styles. So not even attachment to God. So they
Okay.
correlative studies in which they took your they took an inventory of your attachment style, and then they correlated it with religious beliefs and religious attitudes.
Oh, and that's how we kind of got started.
And then so it's not from there. It's not a big leap to say, well, God is kind of the ultimate caregiver, if you will. Being all perfect, all powerful, all knowing, all loving, depending on which religious tradition you're in.
Mm-hmm.
You can start to kind of work with the idea of God as an attachment figure.
Gotcha. So I think the study you sent me mentioned something about how we could correlate certain big five personalities to some extent with uh, your God attachment style.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's a little bit of a leap where, yeah, you're talking about correlating uh, adult attachment styles with belief in God. But the study you sent me actually had God as the attachment figure.
Right. Yep. And I guess I was just trying to show the progression of thought in the research.
Yeah. Okay.
So then, God as the attachment figure, we started to notice that, okay, this actually has some predictive power as well in the realm of religion and psychology, and religious and spiritual issues, which are actually a huge part and is actually gaining quite a bit of ground in the psychological realm. Religious belief, religious attitudes, and it's called RS, which is religious and spiritual struggles, basically. And it was useful, attachment theory, in again giving us a framework to kind of look at people's relationships and attitudes to God.
Mm-hmm. And so that's saying that. So when you say religious struggles, you mean like people having a hard time just with their relationship with God?
Yeah, and a few other things. Like being able to derive comfort from God during a crisis. So say for instance, you have I'm trying to remember.
So not everyone derives comfort from believing in a God.
Yeah, and it's difficult right now because it's kind of a budding field, attachment to God research. And in the study I sent you, that was in the early 2000s. They were trying to develop a more accurate and kind of tight assessment for God attachment. But before then, there were studies to suggest that people who had a secure attachment to God reported much greater satisfaction in life in general, much less anxiety, depression, physical illness. Whereas people with an anxious attachment to God, even with these crude measures, had kind of they kind of paralleled precisely the measure for attachment in romantic relationships. If they had an anxious attachment to God, they were more likely to have an anxious attachment or difficulty in their romantic relationships as well.
Mm-hmm. So
that attachment to God also acted as a predictive factor for other things.
Okay, cool. So where are we now? Like, what's interesting about God attachment in 2020? Is there,
Yeah. So
um, yeah,
yeah. So for example, my last study that I helped implement in my graduate studies was actually trying to see if we could adjust God attachment using self hypnosis.
hmm,
That was a study that wasn't hadn't been done before. Hypnosis is its own little monster in itself. But the basic idea in that study was to try to see if we could give people a self hypnosis. It was a little MP3 file that had a self guided kind of hypnosis prompt. So we recorded it, gave it out to a bunch of students, and then over a 6 week period, they would try to listen to it each day and engage in the self hypnosis. Some of the prompts there um, included things that were associated with a secure attachment to God. So God is embracing you, He's loving you, He's a good Father. So it's really interesting to try now to experiment with different ideas. Okay, now that we have kind of a better idea of what God attachment is and how to measure it, what ways can we help people on a practical level change their relationship to God?
okay. So you hypnotize people and then you tell them God loves you, and you say things about a secure attachment to God and kind of try and put them in a headspace where they would feel a secure attachment to God while they're hypnotized. Do they have
Right.
did they have different outcomes afterwards? Or
So unfortunately, we didn't find any significant differences before and after.
mhm.
But there are a few limitations to the study, and we were hoping to kind of address that in other future studies.
Fair enough.
So hypnosis it's kind of it's definitely it's not in the psychological field it's much has a much different meaning than in the pop culture kind of field. So you can't hypnotize somebody. People hypnotize themselves. So basically, all hypnosis is self hypnosis. And the idea with hypnosis, as it's now understood by serious psychologists, is putting someone in a relaxed state to the greatest extent possible so that their psychological defenses come down and they're more easily able to accept suggestions or ideas that are contrary to their current beliefs.
Hmm.
So cognitive dissonance is a very active and real thing that happens in our day-to-day lives, and
Hmm.
hypnosis tries to bring down those barriers to help people overcome that dissonance when a new idea is something that doesn't fit with their experience
Yeah,
is
yeah.
introduced.
So actually, this is, I think, a good segue into kind of a more philosophical space where I think we've been kind of laying the groundwork for now. Um, but I kind of want to start segueing into, maybe some food for thought for people. Like one question I would have, like you're talking about hypnotizing people and then saying things that give them a secure attachment to God. That's the wrong way of putting it. Saying things that reflect a secure attachment to God.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's this kind of underlying notion that a secure attachment to God is just healthier, maybe
Mm-hmm.
spiritually or even otherwise. I don't know. Um, is that Do you think that's the case? Like, should we strive for a secure attachment to God? Like, should religious people be striving for secure attachment? Like, is this, could we start trying to locate ourselves on this quad chart
Right.
and
Yeah.
try to
So
move in a better direction?
yeah, and I think secure attachment is something in general people should strive for, not only with God, but in their personal relationships, just because it does so much to help people not only survive, but also thrive. The reason that these insecure attachments develop is as a kind of safety mechanism. Okay. So the child learns that, it can't really depend too much on people around them. They either do things inconsistently, they don't respond. You kind of have to take care of yourself in a sense, or do things to a certain extent to prompt people to take care of you, whether that's acting out or what have you. Now, when it comes to attachment with God, the important question to ask yourself is, how do you respond, open and honestly, how do you respond to God when something stressful happens? That's kind of the key. And kind of looking at that open and honestly is kind of the first step. So do I pull away? Am I less able to engage in contemplative prayer where I can just sit and be with God? Is that difficult for me? Mm-hmm. And if it is, then that would kind of give you a good idea of your attachment style to God. Do you avoid him when you're stressed? Does he seem like a judge? Does he seem kind, or does he just not care?
Yeah, actually, now that you're saying this, it's jogging something where in college, I think my attachment style to God changed from secure attachment to somewhere else on the spectrum. Mm-hmm. I'm looking at the notes here. Maybe insecure avoidant, I guess. The note I have was doesn't react when the parent leaves. That's the note I have for that one. So I think towards the end of high school, I started, I guess, getting hit by life in a way that I never had before. And there was a part of my faith that helped me get through it, but then there was another part of my faith that died. I think there was the kind of innocence and sort of grandfather view of God that died. Like C.S. Lewis calls, God's the father, not the grandfather, because the father will actually let your ass get kicked and discipline you, and the grandfather just kind of pats you on the head when you're good. And so when things started, I think I went through about a depression. I didn't get into my top college, and a couple other things were just going south. My health went south for a little bit. And just a bunch of things happened in high school, end of high school. And I think, when I got to college, I think I went from secure attachment to God to sort of insecure avoidant, where it's like I felt like if God's going to leave, I said, okay, bye. And that totally changed my spirituality. I just drifted after that. And yeah, I'm still kind of swinging back, but I could totally relate to that as far as not only your attachment style changing, but your attachment style to God relating to other aspects of life, and maybe vice versa.
Right.
That was a ramble.
I think here it's important to note that there have been studies on neurobiological studies on the brain and prayer. So when people pray, the same system of the brain that lights up when you're talking to another person is the same system that lights up when you're talking to God. So people, when they pray, when they're encountering God, do act as if, right, he is a real person. Okay. And that's a very abstract thing to do, right? And it's kind of quirky for us as humans when things go south, to then attribute that to to personalize the universe, if you will, just on a purely biological level. It's kind of an odd thing to kind of attribute to the universe, to the cosmos, this kind of personal these kind of personal attributes. Now, I think for the more sophisticated, religious believer, we can say that no, it's not so much
the Harvard Catholic.
Right. Yeah. It's not so much the universe that is what's personalized, but exactly as you said, that God does act as a father. Now, a good father, right? One who it has a secure attachment, will allow the child to go through those kinds of things, stressful situations, right, in order to build an internal locus of control, like we mentioned before. So if you have this belief of God as a secure attachment, right, that He is near, that He is consistent, that His responses are they make sense. Then the challenges that you encounter you're going to see them more as tests, as trials, right? Okay, God is testing me. It's tough right now, but I know that when I come to the end of this, He's got my back in the end. He'll be able to comfort me. That is the mark of a secure attachment to God. Now, one quick note about attachment in general is that they do change, right? So it's not like this static thing that you're stuck with. So people who have an insecure attachment can move and resolve those difficulties with the proper kind of support and help later on in life into a secure attachment. And vice versa, or on the other side of that, a secure attachment, and it's usually because of trauma, can turn into an insecure attachment, where you no longer have this kind of fundamental belief that people are trustworthy, that you can be comforted by them, that you can be safe around them. So with kind of what you were saying in your personal account, that totally makes sense. That could happen, right? That the way that you relate to God changes, and for me, that definitely changed as my understanding of God evolved. So in high school, I was a partier. God was there, but he didn't really care about what I did. So for me, it was more of an avoidant thing. But as I learned more about him, I started to spend more time in silence and quiet. And actually, what I would do is before school, I would go to the chapel. I was at a Catholic preparatory school, and I'd sit in the silence there, just a chapel. I wouldn't go talk to my friends. I would just sit, and I would try to be as still as possible. And I think it was there that I really started to learn that no, God does care for me. No, God does want to be around me. And it's kind of my attitude that needed to change towards him.
Yeah. So my brain just went 1,000 places when you were talking there.
Yeah, I love this subject. It's crazy the kinds of applications you can have. And we're, in this discussion, we're not even scratching the surface, I think. There's so many other things that we could talk about, and that could really bear a lot of fruit for people.
Yeah. So what do you think? Like, what's the right question to ask? Like, what's beneath? Like what's something way beneath the surface? You think?
I think with this, it's let's see. Okay, so my mind right now is going to the idea that that with attachment styles and our relationship to God, dang, I just lost it. Give me 1 second. Let me just think about this. Well, now it's tough because I'm coming from a Catholic point of view, and for whoever's listening to this and who has a more religious, maybe Catholic mindset will relate to it more. But for me, it has to do with this sort of incarnational principle that's kind of at the foundation of our faith. That God came down to us as a human person to engage with us. And that is really the mark of, again, a secure father, a secure attachment, in that he feels what we feel. He's suffering what we're suffering.
The concept of is it Emmanuel, right? God is with us.
God is with us. Yeah. Not only is he with us, right? Not only is he just there, but he's feeling what we're feeling. He's kind of mirroring us, right? He's attuning to us when he comes down in the person of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, actually, this is cool because this is connecting something that I was like, another place my brain went. You're actually connecting to that, because one way to think about my own struggles was one of the struggles was the problem of evil, which was why would a loving parent, like I felt like I went through things that a loving parent wouldn't let their kid go through, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that was the problem of evil for me. And I've really been thinking about, as like I'm fine now, like no worries there, but like the way it changed the way I thought about the problem of evil. It's not the abstract Aquinas formula of, well, evil is a form of non-being, so it's not a problem. It was a little more psychological for me, and so I started thinking about the problem of evil in a more psychological way.
Right.
And I started thinking about it in terms of, well, I broke it down into two problems in my head. Like on the one hand, you have, like, let's say, permanent psychological change and temporary psychological change as two different evils you could experience, right? I stub my toe, and that's a kind of discomfort or evil or pain, whatever you want to call it. Mm-hmm. Let's just call it evil because that's the famous name. I stub my toe, and that's a temporary evil that doesn't really permanently change me. I go back to normal once the pain goes away. Mm-hmm. And I think this concept that you're laying out answers that problem of evil. I think it was Nietzsche who said that, like, Jesus answered the problem of evil by becoming a person and suffering. Mm-hmm. And this idea that God's with us where we're at, right? That answers that problem of evil. I don't think it answers the other problem of evil, which it's another side tangent, which I don't have to go on because it's not as related, of the permanent psychological change. I made a YouTube video on this. But I think the problem of evil that has to do with temporary psychological change is totally answered by this concept of Emmanuel that you're laying out. Mm-hmm. I don't think God can relate to permanent psychological change. I'd hope not.
Yeah.
But I think as far that answers half the problem of evil in my mind.
Yeah, and I think it's correct. Now again, like I said before, confirmation bias is a bitch. So when you're talking about this, it is easy, from a religious standpoint to get excited about it. Mm-hmm. But I imagine too that for a lot of people, that's kind of their gut feeling. When it comes to religious struggles, you can really put them in the framework of an attachment style, of an attachment figure. Given the fact that, again, 90% of Americans believe in a higher power and in God, vice versa. I mean, that's a very simplistic way of looking at it, but some sort of higher power. It's not only important. Maybe I should say it this way: it's less important what you believe externally, or kind of the view that you hold externally in the community. Of course, God is a loving creature, or God is a loving provider, and he loves all of his creatures. He's a good father. He takes care of us. These sorts of things. Yeah, of course, God is all these things. Now, in a public social setting, right, that's the right answer. But on a private and internal landscape, that could look very, very different. Or your behaviors, your kind of gut reaction to God internally could be completely contradictory to that. And you do get into a lot of good studies that have been done kind of about these sort of attitudes. Your sort of gut reaction to God can be very, very different to your sort of public
the way you verbalize it.
Yeah.
Actually, my brain is going to people who were raised religious but drifted. And I think that part of that is explained by, I don't want to say explained, but attachment theory, I think, lends a good vocabulary to talk about some of that, because I think the sample of people that I know are kind of like scientifically minded. It's just the people I went to school with. I went to college. I got the physics degree, and so everyone I knew around me was getting some kind of STEM degree. Right. And a lot of them were raised in religious homes and then drifted. And I just assume, statistically, most of them had some level of suffering, because everyone does. No one's life is easy. So you have your average amount of suffering, and then maybe you turn into that insecure avoidant where you're just, it felt like God left and you said, okay, bye. Or maybe some combine that with, all right, you got your own suffering, but then you also got this intellectual, I don't know, this genuine agnosticism, right? So that just screams insecure avoidant, right? And I'm not to psychoanalyze all atheists right now, but I think that this is kind of ringing a bell, at least from the sample of secular people that I know and who have drifted, where intellectually you're kind of agnostic. You don't know like who who knows, but then it's a combination of that, plus you're maybe dissatisfied by the way religious people around you have been behaving. Maybe there's some bad behavior that they're just blind to, and you're just so turned off by their behavior, and combined with a little bit of suffering that you experience, and then all of a sudden you felt like God left and you said, okay, bye.
Right.
And I'm not saying that's all atheists. I'm just saying, like, I wonder how well that captures the ones I do know. Because I definitely know some, like, at least one or two that I've been talking to where it's like, if God exists, I have a problem with them. Or maybe it's a little more disorganized.
Yeah, and I'm thinking of a study right now that's coming to mind, of one that I was briefly on. We were working with this population of homeless men in Texas. This man, he had given, I don't know, it was like $2 or $3 million for what's called a tiny community. And the program was called Community First, and it was actually his way of kind of sticking it to the government, and the government's program of what's called Housing First. So with the homeless problem, it's the government took on this kind of, we just need to get these people houses, we just need to get them into homes and off the streets, and they'll be fine. But this Christian Catholic man, he was like, no, that's completely wrong. We need to give them community. And so he actually transformed this little trailer park into these tiny homes, where there was communal showers, there were communal kitchens. They had a movie theater that these men ran, and a food truck that these guys cooked for. So they actually gave them jobs and community and fellowship. And so I had, really quite a bit of luck in began reading some of the answers that these men had given to assessments of their religious and spiritual attitudes. And it was really interesting because men who reported greater distress and religious struggles were also more likely to respond to the question, do you believe God exists, with a no. So it was a very interesting thing. They had this outward sort of proclamation, God doesn't exist. But they still answered these questions, that were geared towards God. They said, God is a loving Father, or God is wrathful. God only cares about your sins. They responded to these questions as if God existed. Now again, we want to try to avoid generalizing, but it does, I think, on a human level, kind of flesh out this idea that attachment is really primal. And even before any external proclamation of belief, we have these sort of attitudes that are ingrained in us at birth, about other people, about ourselves, and about the universe, God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think this is kind of transitioning into another place I think that would be interesting to talk about, which is, we're talking about God attachment, but there's also this secular side and what they're saying. And so kind of the voices of all my atheist friends are kind of chirping in the back of my head as we're talking about this.
Good.
And there's kind of straw man statements that get amplified by the internet, which things like religious people just believe in God because they're superstitious, or because they're afraid of death, or because it's comforting. But that doesn't describe, that doesn't tell me anything interesting about like what religious people actually are like. Like it just doesn't tell me. It just gets the phenomenology wrong. Like it just gets the facts wrong about how religious people appear to be around God. Like that's just not, like, for just about this attachment theory discussion, right? God, from the perspective of religious people, seems to be like a fact of the cosmos that has to be navigated. It's not a reaction to superstition, right? This is just like there's something else. This is I don't want to say playing with, it's working, it's cooperating with this ancient system that we have in our brains, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's just not that simple. And
right,
like, there was another place I was going to go with this, but did you have any?
Yeah. As we're fleshing these ideas out, I mean, this is kind of the first conversation we've had about this.
Yeah.
So I think you're right. I think it does, attachment to God and the research that we have available does lend itself to a more sophisticated argument that religious people can kind of equipped in responding to these kind of simplistic arguments against religion. I guess one way of responding to those arguments might be the statement that everyone has a religion, in that religion is kind of your fundamental belief, what you relate to on a gut level. And with that definition in mind, okay, these atheist proponents, saying, oh, religious people are just superstitious. Religious people just are afraid of death and they can't handle the fact, so they have to have, an afterlife. Well, on a logical level, those are ad hominems. They don't really address the argument, does God exist? It's just saying something about the people who hold that belief. But then,
not all atheists are saying this. I have heard many of these before, but and I think the internet is amplifying these straw man attacks.
For
Just
sure.
throw that
And
out there.
you know,
Like,
I think
yeah,
people like Sam Harris, are definitely much more sophisticated, and can really address these arguments much better. And there's plenty of people out there who can, and that's a really great thing. It's good for us to be able to kind of dialogue and have these discussions.
yeah. But it's nice to have the counterfactual for religion is just blank.
Yeah,
And that gives, I can dismiss religion and belief in God by saying it's just this. And this seems to be the counterfactual. God attachment seems to be a counterfactual to the oversimplified atheist trope, right?
yeah.
Because it's not just that. Like it's whatever you think it is, it's bigger, right?
It's deeper.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's not just a simple sort of superstitious belief. And if you think, in our day and age, like, what does anybody have the need for superstition for, right? If we're thinking about it psychologically, one of the ways you can think about superstition is that it does enhance a person's internal locus of control, right? If I do X, if I sacrifice X, I can more, more effectively control the outcome of Y, right? Um, and so it does function in that way very similarly to attachment, but religious belief is I think we can say much deeper than a simple insecurity or a simple fear of death, because there's such a plethora of studies to demonstrate that it actually touches something more primal in us, right? And I'm not sure, where to go with that. I haven't made these kinds of connections, with the research in attachment to God and how it might apply to debating atheists. But I think that would probably be the line of thought to go on. Is something about religious belief is much more primal than just that. And I guess a counter argument to that could be, well, what's more primal than a fear of death, right? Than a fear of our own destruction. And that's a good point. But attachment is kind of one of the ways in which we combat that, right? That's why, from an evolutionary standpoint, again, it's a way in which we protect ourselves as children. We learn to get our needs met, and we learn how to develop good pro-social relationships, right? That enhance our chances of survival. And from an evolutionary standpoint, you can say that, yes, religious belief actually enhanced our survival. I think you could make that argument, a pretty good argument based on that fact is religious belief, enhanced our cultures, enhanced our ability to kind of relate to each other. So it does serve as this, sort of survival function. I think I'm getting a little off topic, but
No worries.
Yeah, it definitely, I think, works in favor of a more sophisticated view of religious belief.
Yeah. No, I like it. We're getting philosophical. Definitely diverging a little. We're stretching the concepts a little bit here, but
For sure.
So one place maybe to kind of close it off on a positive note. When someone has a secure attachment to God, what does that look like? Like, what's the first things that pop into your head? Kind of off the spur of the moment, but
Right.
what is it like to be a person with a secure attachment to
God? Well, so something that characterizes a secure attachment, and a word that's actually surprisingly relatable for a lot of people, is warm. God is generally warm and responsive to me. So attuned, right? He kind of empathizes with me, and we have a back and forth, just like that image of the mom and the baby, right? Um, he knows, when to be supportive and protective of me, but then also, to kind of let me make my own mistakes. Um, and then I think finally, my relationship with God is comfortable. I'm happy and satisfied with it. It's been a great source of comfort for me. So I think those three things would probably characterize a secure attachment to God. It is warmth and responsiveness. God is protective and supportive, but also lets me make my own mistakes, right? And then finally, like, I am I'm happy with it. I'm satisfied. I'm comfortable.
He loves me enough to let me grow and get in trouble and learn.
Yeah.
Actually, there was I remember, I don't know, this is a few years ago. There was a philosopher in Oxford, I believe, who was studying the problem of evil specifically, and he came up with a kind of psychological framing of the problem and a psychological answer to the problem. And the way he was putting it was something like, he did this in a super philosophical way too. It was hilarious.
Yeah.
But it was, imagine this counterfactual where it's like, what if I was in a different universe that wasn't as bad, right? You can imagine I was in a universe where, everyone was in a bouncy house and no one stubbed their toes, and no one got splinters because wood was made out of marshmallows. I don't know, but you could imagine a world that was a lot kinder to people. And the question is, why don't I find myself in that world, right? If God loves me, if God cares about me, why don't I find myself in that world? And his answer was, well, because you wouldn't be you, right? Because your hardships and everything you've experienced kind of has turned you into you. And God doesn't want the you in that other world. He wants the you that's in this world. Like the short answer is because God wants you and not the counterfactual you.
Right.
Right. And it's kind of an emotional, heartwarming, kind of philosophical answer. I remember the thing I was going to say, because it's related, which was when I'm talking with people who aren't religious, I think it's very hard to talk about, like, because I know what it's like to feel like I'm in a relationship, like a good relationship with God, and I know what it's like to feel like I don't believe in God. Like, I know both those feelings, and so it's like, yeah, and how do I have conversations with people that bridge the gap, and how do I talk in a way that both sides can understand? And I think the one way I'm experimenting with is, like, the first question you ask is, like, if I'm a Christian and I'm talking to an atheist, like, the first question I would ask is, like, what's your relationship with reality? And it's kind of related to God attachment, because some people say, like, if God exists, we have a problem. And that says something about their whole story and their relationship with just they just see the world as just a brutal place where I get my ass kicked and then I die.
Right.
And it's like, I think that's one of the driving that's one of the driving motivators behind, like, what does a secure attachment to God look like? Like, in the back of my head, it's kind of addressing that concern that people have, which is like, life sucks and then you die. Like, that's in the back of people's minds. And
but then one thing that comes to my mind is, on the flip side, how can you have someone like, I don't know if you know of Immaculée. I
know the name, rings a bell.
Survivor of the Rwandan genocide.
Yeah.
So she spent, I think, like 90 days or something in a bathroom in a small house with like 5 or 6 other women. And she went through this horrible. She watched her family die. She watched her whole village slaughtered by this other tribe, right? How can you have someone go through such a horrific and traumatic experience and come out with such a seemingly, right, at least outwardly, genuine and warm personality that doesn't really jive with our perception of someone who's been through something like that. She seems to have a secure attachment with God in which she trusts that he's supportive, that she's comfortable talking with him. And I think my mind keeps going to the idea of cognitive dissonance, is that for some people, how you resolve that in, I think, a lot of ways determines your outward belief of God. Right. So, again, the problem of evil, how can evil exist, right? How can this have happened to me? Or how can, God exist if he's all loving, all powerful? How can he watch me be abused sexually by my grandfather? Or how can he let my sister go through this abusive relationship? And it all comes down to how you resolve that cognitive dissonance, I think. And I know that might sound, I think it is, but that to me might be one way in which these sort of one way to think about at least how these beliefs develop.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, it's funny because this is kind of a long way coming, because I mentioned before, like, I had this way of framing the problem of evil where instead of one problem, let's break it into two problems. One where there's temporary psychological pain and one where there's like permanent damage, permanent psychological damage. And the temporary pain one is easier, where it sucks. You stub your toe and you perturb your system, and then it goes back to steady state.
Right.
And God entered into that. Like, this concept of Emmanuel kind of answers that. But then you're talking more about the problem of evil in the context of permanent psychological damage and our attachment styles and how those are altered. And this kind of gets pretty dark pretty quick, but the answer I've been kind of converging on after having met people who've experienced permanent psychological damage or harm from abuse, or that's kind of on the heavy end, but even on the lighter end, someone who's just like lonely, like chronic loneliness is that changes your baseline perspective on things, and how do you answer that problem of evil? And the kind of answer I've been converging on recently is this concept of a sacrificial anode, which is total engineering term, not to get philosophical, not to ramble too much, but like, if you have in engineering, if you have a piece of machinery that's about to go into the wild, into a corrosive, harsh environment, a lot of times you'll put a sacrificial anode over it. And the whole concept is you have this useless piece of metal that gets eroded by the environment, and it dies. Like, it's a structure that just gets eroded and damaged for the purpose of the important machinery underneath surviving.
Yeah.
And so I think that one of the answers, like, so if you have a secure attachment to God, how do you navigate hardships? And the answer is, if you have a secure attachment to God, you see these extreme hardships as sacrificial anodes, where it's like, all right, something is getting killed inside of me through this really harsh experience. Like, there's something psychologically that's just, there's a pre-existing structure that's just damaged, or there's something like, there's an innocence inside of me, or there's something inside of me that's not coming back. And how do I grapple with that? And how do I move forward? And it's just the realization, which the thing that died didn't matter in the first place. And the reason I could believe that, like, is because I have a secure attachment to God. Like, there's something about this concept of secure attachment to God which kind of makes that work. And I kind of threw a lot at you in a short amount, in a couple of minutes.
Yeah, and I would put a caveat. It at least makes it more likely that it will work. Right? You can have a secure attachment to God and still, experience a hardship and something breaks. So I think
Well, I think I might be an example of that. In high
yeah.
school, I feel like I did have a secure attachment, and then something.
Right. Yeah, and it's right here where we do. I mean, again, we're just scratching the surface in our discussion, but like, so what exactly is your image of God? Okay, so God attachment does in large degree depend on your image of God. Um,
Well, because
and
maybe you could have just spitballing, but maybe you could have like a naive secure attachment versus a ruggedized secure attachment,
right. So like shit's happened to me,
and it's
and
still secure.
like God's right, and so God's still comforting, right? Or on the flip side, you can have kind of a judgmental or merciless view of God. I think a good example of this actually you do see in some of the writings of Therese of Lisieux, the saint, the French saint, and that she lived in a time where Jansenist ideas of God, where God is a judge, God only cares about your sins. Mercy isn't really emphasized. Plays a big role in how you relate to God. And I think that would be a discussion for another time. And actually, probably it might have been good to first establish your image of God, because that's also another area of research that's really robust.
I'll ask you
But
about it next time.
very closely married to attachment to God. Yeah, and if I may just kind of recap this whole session, I think it's a very established fact nowadays that attachment is primal, that we do as humans tend to relate to people in these predictable ways, right? It kind of acts as it does act as a survival mechanism, right? And we have this weird idea that somehow there's this guy, this person
Attachment figure.
who looks after us, who this ultimate caregiver, right? That we do relate to in a real way, and that many people do. And that, in a large degree, affects our religious beliefs, right? Not only externally, but also internally, right? And that goes for atheists, Christians, Muslims, anybody in between. It's a really fascinating topic that has a lot of implications for religious discussions, philosophical discussions, and we're just scratching the surface.
Sounds like it. I think we're getting close to a pretty good place to wrap up. Was there anything you wanted to add, throw in? Was any attachment theory, God attachment, anything else you wanted to cover?
That's pretty much it. For now, again, like I could go in a lot of different directions with this.
All right, sounds like a good first podcast then.
Yeah.
All right, so we'll table some of this for next time then.
Sweet.
Maybe talk about image of God or who knows what. Maybe we'll talk about cigars and s'mores and bonfires. I don't know.
Yeah. That'd be pretty cool. Hopefully, it'll be a little cooler, because right now it's pretty muggy. I don't know.
Is it raining up where you are too?
Yeah. It's pretty warm in here right now too.
Oh no, it's been like muggy and rainy down in Groton all day.
Okay.
But, all right. Well, hey, thanks for christening the podcast. This is great.
Yeah.
Appreciate
Hopefully,
it.
you can edit out the parts that don't make me look too good, and
I'll just cover your half of the screen.
yeah, because I'm all like sweaty and stuff. Maybe you could just have me as cheese.
Yeah, no, if you just like lower your head below, I'll take a screenshot and no.
Yeah.
Lower.
My head this way. No, because that's my hair's all greasy and stuff right now. I don't
No,
know
you're getting through the pandemic pretty well. It looks like you're exercising. You're not losing gains.
Here, so that's nice.
There you go. Well, you got the home gym in the basement.
Yeah, Emily and I aren't sure what we're gonna do when we move down to South Carolina.
Yeah.
But I think they're waiting for me to watch Avatar, actually.
All right. Sounds good. Yeah. Thanks for coming on. Till next time.
Yeah, and I hope that was helpful. Yeah, it definitely helped me flesh out a bunch of ideas and
Yeah, same,
kind of
same,
think about these things on a deeper level.
same. All right.
Uh,
Thanks for coming. I'm gonna click the stop button